Welcome to Through the Glass. Very happy to have my friend Udi Ofer. He is the Deputy National Political Director of the ACLU. He is the National Director of the Justice Division of the ACLU, and he is a visiting lecturer at Princeton University. Welcome, my friend. Thank you for coming on Through the Glass.
It's great to be here.
It's good to see you. I haven't seen you in a while.
I know. It's, the COVID lockdown has been hard on friendships, but it's good to see you in person. I love this space. It's incredible. I have so much pride in this because I love Asbury, and to see Asbury have a gem like this makes me really happy.
Asbury's the best. Is that the last time we hung out? Was it last year's SeaHearNow festival?
I think we came to a birthday in your house. Was it your birthday?
We never look. I'm a dad. We get no
so maybe,
celebration.
Yeah, maybe it was one of your kids' birthday.
It's definitely a lady or a child.
Yeah, I remember being at a birthday party at your place since SeaHearNow. But SeaHearNow was so much fun, and I was so bummed that it was canceled in 2020. But the more I get to know Asbury, the more I love it. So this is a new side of it that I haven't seen. And I don't know, when I think of Asbury Park, I think of you. Right? Because I feel like you're just always doing such interesting things. So I think, I'm one of your groupies. I love your music. I love your writing. So I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, man. I'm one of your groupies. We met through my wife, Julie, and her friendship with you.
Who's definitely
and
much
your
cooler
wife.
than you, but that's okay.
Much is an understatement. Julie's the best. She's a very smart person, like yourself. So once in a blue moon, really cool, smart people will attract people like me, and I'll just sort of I'll get in the fold somehow. So.
I just BS it really well, so I don't know.
How did you guys meet? You guys met in college, right?
How did I meet who? Julie?
Yeah.
Or Kim?
Julie.
I don't remember when I first met her, to be honest. So we met her through what we call our ski house crew, right? So I think it was back in 2003 or 2004 when I just started dating my current partner, Casey. We decided that we love snowboarding, and I had a friend from law school who I ran into in the airport one day, and I think he was holding like a surfboard because he was going like surfing in Hawaii or something. And I was like, oh, cool, you're into surfing? He's like, yeah. And I was like, oh, we're into snowboarding. And he's like, oh, my God, I belong to a ski house in Vermont. We actually have an opening. Do you want to join? And we were like, yeah, for sure. I mean, this is, wow, it's amazing to think this is like 17, 18 years ago. Anyway, we joined the ski house, and the group of people that belong to it, which, kind of evolved over the years, but there's like a core of like 10 to 15 people that we've all become the best of friends. And now all the kids are like getting to know each other and learning how to snowboard together. But anyway, one of the people there is someone who has known your wife since they were kids, right?
That's
Kim.
Right. That's right.
So
I forgot that was the connection.
That's the connection.
You were sort of once removed. Really,
well, yeah.
And
so at some point, Kim introduced us to Julie, and I think like one of the first things we did with her. These are like random memories. I can't even believe I remember, but I think we went to Six Flags Great Adventure together, like, I don't know, like 2010 or 11. Those were the wild years, right? The pre-kids where you would, skip out of work and go to Six Flags. That's about as exciting as I get.
I don't know about that. We've hung out a few times. I don't know about that.
Careful there.
When you when you mentioned law school,
yeah.
What drove you to want to go to law school?
Yeah.
What were your experiences that had given that itch to you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I was born in Israel, to a family that, politics were kind of part of, particularly for my dad, was kind of part of growing up, someone who would always talk about social issues. And growing up in Israel in the 1970s, it was still like a new country. And so many of the people that we were surrounded by were people who had escaped persecution from, Nazi Germany, Eastern Europe, and moved to Israel as a way to find refuge. And I grew up with the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust, being like a major part of my life. I mean, in the sense of I would watch all the movies. I remember reading The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which is a book that's probably, I don't know, it's at least 1,000 pages long, like when I was like 13 or 14, and being like obsessed with how could this injustice happen. And it's very present in Israel. Like the Holocaust is something that, is part of life. At least it was in those days. I don't know if it's still as true. Anyway, so then we moved to the United States when I was 6. We lived here for a couple of years, but then back to Israel, moved here permanently since the age of 10. And when we moved to the U.S., we had very little money. We moved to, the non-gentrified parts of Brooklyn. This is back in 1985. There were 5 of us in a 1-bedroom apartment. I mean, me and my 2 sisters used to share a bedroom, and my parents slept in the living room where there was a pull-out couch. And in many ways, we had that immigrant experience, right? In Brooklyn, in New York City. I remember, my parents were born in Russia. They had moved to Israel when they were teenagers. And I remember kind of growing up in Brooklyn at that time. I thought all Russians were Jews because that's what I was surrounded by, like Russian immigrants who had come to America for a better life. But the whole immigrant experience was so present also. So you had the combination of knowledge of history and this extreme persecution, living in an immigrant community in Brooklyn, with not having a lot of money. My mom also had breast cancer when I was growing up. She eventually died from it, but it was something that was very present in my life. I think all of these injustices just made me wanna make the world a better place. I mean, it's really as cliche as that. I would say it didn't really have a lot of direction at that time. I went to college, and in college was kind of the first time where I started wearing my politics on my sleeve, kind of joined every possible social justice organization you could join, started writing a lot, became an editor of one of the school papers, started a bunch of organizations.
Where is this?
So this is SUNY Buffalo. I'm a huge SUNY fan. I mean, Rutgers is a great system too, but as a New Yorker, growing up in New York, now I'm a New Jerseyan, I love the SUNY system. It gave me exactly what I needed. My family, we didn't have a lot of money. It wasn't really an option to go to a private university. And, you go to the SUNY system, and it's just, you meet incredible people. The facilities are incredible. The level of teaching is amazing. But it also gave me kind of the freedom to find myself and to meet people who were different than me. I had I had a childhood where we were moving from one country to another, moved from Chicago to New York. I had a pretty sheltered childhood in the sense of, again, kind of the immigrant experience. I always had a different name. I always felt, different than everyone around me. And I think going to the SUNY system, suddenly I'm surrounded by people who everyone has names that are different than what you watch on TV, life experiences that are different.
That's one of the best parts of, I think, one of the best things you could extract from a college experience. The ability to get outside of your shell, see and hear some things that you didn't know existed, weren't aware of, even things that are shocking or offensive, it could be argued are very healthy, so you can process these things. And I just think that's one of the best things that can come out of a college experience. And this was in Buffalo?
This was in Buffalo. And, I met, I grew up, I grew up partially in Israel and Brooklyn. I had never met a Palestinian person before I went to college. And in college, I met Palestinians who became, part of my community. And we would have open conversations about Israel and Palestine. And it totally opened up my horizons. I started taking women's studies classes and kind of, studying feminism, which made me also look at my mother's experience with breast cancer in a totally different way. It just completely changed my framework of how I looked at myself, how I looked at my own privileges. And then coming out of college, I graduated, and I wasn't sure what to do. So I started working in the West Village at the Comedy Cellar and the Olive Tree Cafe. For anyone who it's on McDougal Street. It's like one of the kind of oldest, most historic streets in New York City, right next to Mamoun's Cafe, which I love living in Princeton now, where there's also a Mamoun's, which makes me feel like I'm at home.
They opened up something near us, too.
Here in Asbury?
Right near where Julie and I live, in Wall.
I think they're originally from this. I think the family is actually from this. They may be from Monmouth County.
That's interesting because they tout the famous New York.
Right.
It's good food, man.
It's great. No, I love Mamoun's. It's
really good.
It is genuine. But in between college, so I was a waiter for like 3-4 months, and then at that time, my best friend and I, so this guy Jim, who was one of my buddies in Buffalo, we decided we want to start exploring this country. Right, we had a lot of friends who were starting to like go backpack in Europe, and we were like, we want to get to know the United States. So you had this little Hyundai Excel hatchback, manual car at that time that was probably worth like $8,000 new. We got in that car one day, and we started traveling around the country for 4 months, where we literally went to every state except for North Dakota. For some reason, we never crossed that border to go to North Dakota. And that's when I really got to know the United States and felt like, okay, this is a country that I feel like I belong to, that I love, but I also want to make a better place. The first part of our road trip, we retraced the civil rights movement. We went to all the major sites in like Little Rock, Arkansas, Birmingham, Alabama, Memphis, Tennessee. And it was incredible. And we also realized that every part of the country has its own unique identity. So it was that experience. Literally while I was driving cross country, I started applying for law schools. And by the time I got back, I realized I got into a law school, Fordham Law School. And I went to law school because I wanted to save the world. It was literally as defined as that. I wanted to do good. I felt like having a law degree will give me legitimacy, also teach me about, how the system works. And I wasn't crazy about the law school experience. I actually... the first year experience of law school is the worst, right? They force you to take classes that most people who go to law school have no interest in, like contracts and property, right? If you're someone who went to law school because of civil rights, because of the Constitution, many, if not most law schools don't even require that you take a constitutional law class, right? They require that you take a property class or a contracts class because that is the foundation of our legal system. And I had no interest in that. So I actually stopped going to class like at some point, during my first year experience. Also, my mom was really sick. But the school, and I actually feel really grateful. They were like, look, stay on, don't drop out. And I stayed. And I ended up, really enjoying law school. Second and third years, I got to take whatever classes I wanted. And since then, basically, I had a privilege of right after law school getting one of these fancy fellowships that allowed me to do whatever I wanted to do. It's called the Skadden Fellowship. And then 2 years later, I joined the ACLU, and I've been there for the past 18 years in many different capacities. So I went to law school to save the world. And I do feel like it gave me the tools that now I use to try to make this world at least a bit better.
That's interesting because lawyers, it's not always synonymous with a superhero.
Right. Well, definitely I don't consider, I don't think we're superheroes, but look, it was either become an organizer. I actually remember I started doing canvassing for a grassroots organization in Brooklyn in between college and law school. And I really thought I was going to go into organizing, right? Because organizing is something I still genuinely believe in. But then I saw how there weren't enough lawyers who had what we call like a movement orientation, right? So there's a whole conversation within kind of the public interest world, the progressive legal world. What does it mean to be a lawyer who's fighting for social justice, right? And I used to teach a class on this where we would use 2 examples from history to show how you could be 2 different kinds of lawyers. And I'll ask you these questions. I'm sorry, I'm going to do a pop quiz right now, but
I'm ready.
How did the U.S. end legal segregation in our public schools?
How did the United States end
legal how did legal segregation in public schools end? There's like
through an amendment.
No, through right. There's like
oh, now I'm embarrassed.
No.
Really.
Brown v. Board of Education, right?
During the Johnson administration.
No, so it was a Supreme Court decision, right? Brown v. Board of Education said schools cannot be segregated, right? It was like a big legal case, right? You had Thurgood Marshall, incredible civil rights lawyer, who brought all these lawsuits. And in 1954, the Supreme Court comes down with a decision, says, in Brown versus Board of Education, says, our schools cannot be legally segregated. I didn't explain it well, so it's not your fault.
You're being very kind.
No. But that was like a movement that was based on, lawyers and litigation and Supreme Court decision. But then there's another movement. How did the United States end segregation in our bus systems, in our public transportation systems?
By putting pressure on the companies. They put financial pressure and
but there
organizing was and saying, well, we're not going to use your product. And
but
every
who
company
was the star of that organizing, right? A woman by the name of Rosa Parks,
sure.
right? She
sure.
decides not to, get up from her seat to give a white man the ability to sit in the front of the bus. And she refused to go to the back of the bus.
Yeah.
That, Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott, led to the elevation of Martin Luther King. He was at that time a young preacher, a young organizer. And that whole campaign made him kind of a public spokesperson for the civil rights movement. Legal segregation in public transportation system also ended with a Supreme Court decision, but no one knows about that Supreme Court decision. Like, no one has ever studied it. Kids don't know about it because the whole movement was about Rosa Parks, was about Martin Luther King giving a speech every Sunday at the church, at the local church in Montgomery, riling up the masses. It was about people, starting to walk to work instead of taking the buses. And it led to this whole social movement. So here we have two examples of lawyers who did good things. But in one, in Brown v. Board of Education, lawyers were the focal point. In the other, kind of regular people were the focal point. Even though Rosa Parks, she was an activist. She didn't one day decide, I'm going to get up from a bus. That's how it's taught to us. But no, she was an activist. She was actually, she purposefully used this to activate a movement. There was another woman who similarly was going to become the spokesperson for the movement. I think it was her name, Claudette Colvin. She actually recently spoke in New Jersey about a year ago or a couple of years ago. I'm pretty sure that's her name. But she also became pregnant and she was young. She was, I think, 18 or younger. And the movement elders kind of felt this wasn't a good spokesperson for the movement. And we could argue about that, but Rosa Parks was. The point that I'm making was all about how do you build a movement and what should the role of lawyers be. And for me, I like to think that I'm the type of lawyer who has a movement orientation that is not about, the fancy lawyer arguing before the Supreme Court, but is all about how do we change narrative, right? How do we change culture? How do we make people think differently about marijuana, about gay marriage, about the death penalty, about police? And you don't do that by shoving it through litigation. You do it by changing the way people not only think about it, but the way they feel about it. And that's the hardest part, getting people to change the way they feel. And that's the kind of the area where I obsess about. I don't pretend to know all the answers. I have a lot of questions. But that's the type of lawyer that I try to be, someone who helps us as a nation think and feel differently.
A lot of the issues that you just mentioned, death penalty, marijuana, etc., they tie very closely into, you talked about changing people's hearts and how they feel about things. Of course, that's the hardest thing. A lot of those things are tied into religious beliefs. And it seems in a country like ours that, on paper has a separation of church and state, that's really where religious ideas have seemed to have kept a strong hold. And I always thought it was very ironic that sometimes the more righteous states or Christian states, if you will, were the most liberal with the death penalty. I grew up in a Christian household. I sort of left the faith when I was young, but I just remember all the lessons, and basically the first lesson is, don't kill anyone.
Right. And
partnered with that is this idea of forgiveness and turning the other cheek and let he who hath no sin cast the first stone, all of this. And I could never square that with capital punishment, regardless of the crime, regardless. How have you noticed that religion has tied into some of the struggles for all these issues you mentioned, which I'm on your team for all of those issues and pretty much always have been.
Yeah. I think it goes actually both ways. Some of our biggest allies right now in the movement to repeal the death penalty, in the movement to end mass incarceration. So the world that I live in the most professionally in and personally, is this movement to end mass incarceration in the United States. Some of our best allies are actually evangelical Christians. There is an organization called Prison Fellowship, which goes into prisons to provide services to people who are incarcerated. They're usually at the front lines of the fight to get people out of prison, to change the laws. Some of the biggest advocates against the death penalty right now are Christian organizations. I think where it becomes complicated, I think when religion is politicized, like we saw in the rise of the Christian right in the United States during the 1980s and 1990s, that's when it becomes a bad formula in particular. Because I think, look, I don't pretend to be a scholar of religion, but I've talked to many people who do pretend or actually are scholars of religion. And obviously you could find verse to be able to justify either position, right? About whether, how you should treat someone who's incarcerated, how you should treat someone who committed something wrong. What are values of forgiveness and second chances come in. So I think ultimately, and this is how I view the world, so there's a bit of self-bias here. I think it's more about what is the political moment that we're in that will then define which religious views get elevated the most. Because I think within religion, you could find camps on all sides. So right now in the United States, we've gone through what's called an Overton window shift, right? Where the conversation around law and order, criminal justice, reform, is very different than the conversation we had 20 years ago, right? 20, 30 years ago, the people who were calling for more death penalty, more people locked up, more prisons, were absolutely the religious right, along with many Democrats like Joe Biden and Bill Clinton. Today, some of the biggest advocates for fewer prisons, for criminal justice reform, are people on the religious right.
Well, that's good to hear. I mean, you don't hear about that a lot. I mean, I assume, mass media and moneyed interests, like to keep division amongst groups. Imagine if every small group found their common interests bound together with some smart lawyers. I mean, that would be a real populist movement, wouldn't it?
Yeah, look, we saw it during the Trump administration, right? The 4 years of Donald Trump were horrible. And I work at the ACLU. We had to sue Donald Trump more than 400 times. Every day we would have to fight against all the horrible things that he was doing. He did some really good stuff on criminal justice reform.
Talk about it.
Yeah, so the First Step Act was a law that, it didn't pass because of him. There were some advocates on the right that we worked with who helped us get access to the White House and be able to convince the administration to do something good. And eventually he was convinced, and he didn't stop it from happening. But a lot of what presidents do is stop things, and he didn't stop it, so I'll give him credit. But he supported passage of the First Step Act, which has led to thousands of fewer people incarcerated in federal prison.
What are the bullet points of the First
Yes,
Step
it did a few things. Like, one of the things that it did is we've had this disparity in our drug sentencing laws really since the 1980s, and Ronald Reagan, and also when Democrats were pushing for the beginning of the war on drugs, that created a disparity in sentencing between how much were you caught with crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. And even though so you would get sentenced to a much longer term if you're caught with much less crack than you were with powder cocaine. And this is obviously race-based, right? It was totally class and race-based. If you're poor and don't have access to money, you're going to consume crack. If you have money, you're going to consume powder cocaine. And this was kind of built, these injustices were built into law. There used to be 100-to-1 disparity. Under Obama, it was reduced to 18-to-1. Under Trump, these laws were applied retroactively, so that people who were currently incarcerated could benefit from this law. a change that happened during the Obama years. Other things, people were given more opportunities to have months and years shaved off their sentences based on good behavior. Some of the barriers to reentry. When someone, we have more than 2 million people incarcerated in the United States on any given day. About 600,000 people every year leave prison. When they leave prison, they face tremendous hurdles. There are nearly 45,000 legal restrictions on someone when they leave prison. 45,000. I'm not making this up. This is not ACLU propaganda numbers. This was the American Bar Association a few years ago actually counted all of the statutes that exist to create the legal bar. So everything from like, being able to get a barber's license to being able to eligible for federal financial aid for school, all of that recently changed. There are 45,000 legal restrictions. So it's almost impossible for someone to reintegrate back into society, which is why we have such high recidivism rates in the United States as compared to other nations, right? When someone gets out of prison, there's a strong likelihood that a few years later, they'll end up back in prison. And one of those reasons is because it's impossible for them. They wear a scarlet letter for the rest of their life. Every job they apply to, they get asked, do you have a criminal record? And people screen them out without even giving them an interview. So those are the types of, during the Trump years, we saw some positive movement in this area. So that wasn't because Donald Trump, who was like, believes in the death penalty, right? Believes in stop and frisk. It wasn't because he wanted to do this good stuff. It was because he was surrounded by advocates on the right and on the left who were like, okay, enough. We need to do things differently. Having said all that, while I'm giving like kudos to the right here, which, is, I think it's important, the type of change that we need to see in this nation, we're like, it's so incremental right now that if we continue at this pace, we're still going to have these huge societal problems of mass incarceration, 30, 40 years from now. So while I appreciate our allies on the right, there are also some distinct differences in terms of like how far we want to go. And that's where you see some of the rifts between the left and the right. But again, some of our biggest allies these days are kind of Christian evangelical organizations. Even like Coke Industries, Coke has been a supporter of some criminal justice reform.
It's important not to paint anything or anyone with a broad brush.
Yeah.
This is good, this is bad. I think it's stifling a conversation. It's a shortcut to thinking. So it's important that you're saying this. I think especially now. And you could also argue, amongst the two political systems, the left is still pretty freaking far right. The fact that we can't get a conversation about early childhood education, we can't get a conversation about healthcare, we can't get a conversation about third parties getting a seat at the table. The left is really fucking right.
Yeah.
In our country, and has been for decades.
It depends, right, what parts of the left, right? So I'm super immersed in the left in the United States. I probably see things that 99.9% of the population doesn't see. But look, I think I genuinely believe that one of the big consequences of the Trump years is going to be that the American public shifted a bit more to the left. And I know that's a bit counterintuitive, and I'm taking a longer arc. But I think that there was I've been an advocate for 20 years, and I've never seen such a mobilization of people than I did during the Trump years. And we'll take this last summer. The Black Lives Matter protest this past summer was the biggest protest in American history. You know how like our generation kind of studied Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the 1960s and, all these
Vietnam.
Northerners, we surpassed that this summer in terms of how many people came out to the streets to protest, police violence, racial injustice. That's incredible. Now, we're still figuring out as a nation in terms of what does that mean? How do we end the legacy of slavery in the United States? So I think on the policy end of things, there's still a disagreement in many ways. And this is where Joe Biden is not as, I think, radical or even close to being radical as some of the protests.
Yeah, please.
But the movement space is actually pretty radicalized these days. And you see it manifested in a way that you may cringe when I say this, or at least people are listening or watching this. And that's in the police defund space, right? So defund police became one of the slogans this summer of the Black Lives Matter movement. And Americans have such a gut reaction to that phrase. They either hate it or they love it. And few people are in between. Most people hate it when you look at polling. A core group of people love it. But once you unpack what it actually means, it's a pretty basic yet radical concept that actually captures a lot of what you just said, right? The concept is right now as a nation, we spend billions upon billions upon billions of dollars on a mass incarceration system, on a criminal legal system that ruins people's lives and that ruins the lives of their children and their families, that puts human beings behind cages. I mean, when you think about like our criminal, it's pretty wild when you think like we take human beings and we put them in cages. The police make 10 million arrests a year, right? Every 3 seconds, a police arrests someone. Of those 10 million, most people, when they hear that, they're like, okay, well, police, they got to do their job. There's a lot of violence in this country. We need to protect, ourselves and our children.
But we're not talking about violent crime here.
Of those 10 million, 5% have anything to do with violence. That's according to the FBI, 5%. So 500,000. That means that 95% of what police does every day is crack down on low-level offenses, on things like marijuana possession, drug possession, disorderly conduct, what's called broken windows policing. And we're spending billions of dollars on this, right? We have 18,000 police agencies in the United States. The police defund movement is basically just saying, we need to get police and the criminal legal system out of the lives of low-income people, and particularly Black, Latino, Indigenous, low-income people. And we need to take that money that we're spending right now on police and on criminal legal system and invest it in early childhood education, and invest it in more healthcare for all, and invested in what we know will lead to less violence. That is what those protests over the summer were about. So I do think we're at a moment right now in American history where we just sparked something. We really did. I genuinely believe that. I'm not sure where it's going to go, because the similar spark was created in the 1960s, right? Towards the end, Martin Luther King, right before he was killed, remember, he started talking about economic rights. Like, he had shifted his policy asks from pure civil rights to talking about economic rights, to talking about better wages, to talking about fewer foreign wars, right? He came out against the Vietnam War, then he gets assassinated. And then the whole backlash on the civil rights movement begins in the 70s, 80s, 90s. What we call the new Jim Crow led to mass incarceration. There was a huge backlash. We're in this point right now, actually, where we sparked something that was in reaction to Donald Trump's racism. I don't know where it's going to end up. It may end up in a beautiful place where, 5-6 years from now, we'll have basic living wage, we'll have a green economy, we'll have more early childhood education, or it may end up on, actually a backlash of, more of these restrictive policies, less government services, more of this kind of, trickle-down economics that never worked.
Never. I totally agree with you. I think I saw the last some odd years as an opportunity. Sure, there was a lot going on that I did not agree with, and there was just the optics of so many things were so terrible, and optics matter. But on a policy level, there were a few things that I was down with, and it wasn't a popular conversation, so I can appreciate you bringing some of those things up. They were not the majority of things,
right? But
there were some important things in the minority. But I totally agree with you. There's an opportunity here, and I'm not sure which way it's going to go either. But seeing people organize. I'm reading. Have you ever read Thomas Frank?
No.
He had written a pretty popular book, What's the Matter with Kansas?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I just couldn't remember the author name.
And he recently wrote a book called The People Know. And it's a history of populism in the United States. Not so much as the term gets applied now. I believe, as he does, the term is applied to nationalist views, to racist views, when that is not, in fact, what the populist movement was. In the late 1800s, it was, well, the more I'm reading about it, it seems just like now. Worker movements, and primarily, I guess, farmers at the time. And there was a coalition between white northern farmers, black southern farmers, and they were sort of the meat and potatoes of the movement. And they were able to, I mean, William Jennings Bryan, I believe, came out of that. That thinking, and that's probably the closest we ever got. And maybe some of those policies were enacted, maybe with other presidents moving forward up to FDR and all of these folks. It would be nice to see how far a people's movement, and maybe populist isn't the right term to use because you mentioned defund the police. I would totally agree. I really wish, folks, if you're starting a great movement, please see an ad agency or something. Like even Black Lives Matter, you see how just those words can be so polarizing for people. You know, I remember seeing flag, all lives matter. It's like, oh, come on, really? Is that really where the conversation needs to go to? Words matter so much. So putting it out there in the universe, there's got to be some people who have some really clever names for things that leave a benign feeling until someone like you or someone definitely smarter than me can explain policy differences, because I believe the police have way too many things that they have to trifle with in day to day. And of course, that's just their job. We recently had a guest on, Derek Minnow Bloom, and he does a lot of activist work here in the area. And I don't remember exactly which organization. At the end of that podcast, there's a list of all his organizations, folks, if you want to check it out. But he's working with the police, their organization. So let's say there's something, it's not a broken windows situation, as you call it. Hey, spread the word. Don't call the police. Call us. And we'll send out one of our people who can connect with that person. Maybe it's a drug thing. Maybe it's a homelessness thing. Maybe it's hunger thing. Let us handle it, because we're able to have that conversation and not necessarily begin to be one of those 10 million people every year who's arrested, 95% of which, as you pointed out, is nonviolent. So, I mean, I'm kind of ranting here.
No, I totally.
That's a people's movement too. That's people taking it off of police, taking it off of gigantic political parties. How do you recommend a people's movement turns into a political movement when it seems that the two parties are pretty entrenched in their interests, and I'm not so sure that their interests are entrenched in people?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not that old, but I've been now an advocate for 20 years, and I've been a part of enough movements where I saw dramatic shifts in what policymakers are willing to do. So first of all, I think there needs to be a recognition that change is never going to start with the politician. And you could be the best politician in the world. Like, I know Cory Booker pretty well. These days, you know, he's supporting some of the most audacious, like he has, you know, this baby bonds idea, which I feel like you would love. I don't know if you've heard of it, where every baby born should be given $2,000 in an interest-bearing account that will stay with them, and then they have access to that when they turn 18. It's actually a pretty brilliant idea that he believes will fix so many of the income gaps that we have in the United States. And from a government investment point of view, it's actually not that much money compared to how much, you know, through the tax system, you know, we spend or give. But the change is not going to come from the politics. The senators, the city council members, they're the vehicle for the change, right? They're the ones who eventually will have to get it done. But the change is going to come from the bottom and from, you know, the people, as you said. So then the question becomes, like, how do you create that change? How does because there's a lot of great ideas out there, right? I mean, I'm sure in Asbury Park, there's like at least 1,000 different fantastic grassroots ideas for all of the things that should change. Not all 1,000 ideas are going to break through and actually become something. So the movements that I've been a part of where we saw this dramatic shift, I'll start off with the marriage equality movement, right? When I started as an advocate and first became immersed in the LGBTQ kind of political space, the idea of same-sex marriage was so radical. You looked at public polling, the public was not ready for same-sex marriage to happen. Today, our kids are growing up in a world where the idea of lesbian and gay people not being able to marry the people that they love is like unheard of for them. Something changed dramatically. Same with marijuana and the broader war on drugs, although we're not there yet on the war on drugs. Right now, 15 states have legalized marijuana. Virginia is about to, The former, capital of the Confederacy is about to legalize marijuana. I was in a meeting with Chuck Schumer a week and a half ago, the new Senate Majority Leader, where he said, to a small group of advocates, said, I'm going to make this one of my biggest issues. We're going to try to get this done through the Senate.
Why is New Jersey, why has it been stalling? Why is the final step stalling so many times? Because we've talked about this on and off for a while. Like, what's going on?
I don't know. So look, I used to be the executive director of the ACLU of New Jersey. I used to be super immersed in the day-to-day stuff. I'm not as immersed right now, but all I could say is it's inevitable. It's going to happen. Technically, the reason it hasn't happened yet is because there's disagreement about how to treat people who are younger than 18. So the new legalization that's going to take effect as soon as next week, actually, potentially, if they actually get their act together, is now going to legalize marijuana for private consumption for adults. But the question remained, how do you treat young people if they get caught? So there's a lot of bickering around that. But I don't want to get in because, this conversation is going to become outdated in a week because there's always like something different that's going to lead to bickering. But I think the more important point is what happened to the politics of the issue, where right now you will be punished as a governor or a state lawmaker if you don't legalize marijuana, whereas 5-6 years ago, the public would not have punished you. That's the world that I'm always living in, right? Like, how do we change the political incentives for governors, for presidents? And that's where we can use marijuana as an example of today about 68% of the American public supports legalizing marijuana. 68%. That's a huge cultural shift that has occurred in this country over the last several years.
I think a lot of that had to do with the medical applications that have taken place in the last 10 or 20. I could think of even like certain family members of mine who, still might have a very strong stigma on a recreational use, but have really lost the overall stigma because, well, they've seen family members treated in that way, or at least recommended. And, not just like any treatment, doesn't always work, or it has varying effects based on your chemistry. That's how I really saw a lot of people changing.
It's proof of concept, right? It's the same way in the marriage equality space. Civil marriage came first. Remember, that was the first step. So people, gay and lesbian couples were able to form a union. First it was domestic partnerships. Then it was civil unions. People saw the world didn't come to an end. Our whole system of wedlock didn't collapse. And then the public became ready. So there's always these intermittent steps. And I would say, yes, medicinal use is the intermittent step for... But the idea is proof of concept, right? The idea is that we have to show the public is so scared of changes to the status quo. And this is where, look, I believe in populism, but at the same time, we also have to recognize that the vast majority of the public is going to be motivated by self-interest, right? Now, when you talk about economic rights, the self-interests usually unify people because most people get screwed over by corporations or bigger entities than them. And that's why there's a lot of times, economic interests that align. But when you're dealing with, racial justice, when you're dealing with, helping people who have historically been disenfranchised, populism is not always your friend. It becomes a lot more complicated than that. And we saw that in the Donald Trump years, right? Donald Trump, tens of millions of people voted for him. Tens of millions. And they knew, you can possibly argue the first time around, maybe they didn't know what they were getting. But the second time around, they knew what they were getting. They knew they were getting a racist in office who was a white nationalist, right? Believed in white supremacy. Yet tens of millions of people still voted for him. What it's our job as organizers, as movement-oriented people, is to come up with a big, to work with the masses, to have the big audacious ideas of how do we change these systemic injustices. But then it really is like, you gotta hold the hand of the public through the process, because the public is always going to have a bias towards the status quo unless it's a status quo that hurts themselves, right? Because they're going to want to, they want to feel like they're going to be secure. So I think with gay marriage, you saw that, right? If you were a heterosexual couple who thought they didn't know anyone who's gay or lesbian, marriage was really scary until, they started seeing it on TV, until, people started getting, united in other ways. I think with the broader war on drugs, which is what I actually see marijuana legalization is not the end point. The world that I want to see eventually is a world where all drugs are decriminalized in the United States for personal possession, whether it's crack, heroin, cocaine, meth. I know this sounds radical, but by the way, Oregon just did this year. But I believe the values that drive me is I believe that someone should be able to do with their body what they want to do. So the same idea that applies to abortion, in my view, applies to the consuming drugs. Now, if that person is going to hurt someone, then obviously there's a governmental interest in intervening. So that's why it's okay to have regulations around. Sure, you could smoke your crack pipe, but then don't get into a car. Or, if you have a 4-month-old at home, there could be a conversation about whether, that individual is in danger. But if you want to consume drugs, you should be able to do that. And I see marijuana as actually the first step towards a broader conversation to decriminalize all drug possession in the United States. And then once we get that, that's the world that I want to see. So all of these victories are steps towards a greater value-based system that we should be fighting for.
And there are other countries that have these laws. So from a global standpoint, I guess it is still radical, but it's not like insane radical. There are countries doing this, and in many of those countries, it's been hand in hand with prison reform and other things. So they have to be in lockstep. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's all about like the value, the intrinsic value in all of this, I believe, is human dignity, right? Like, how do we approach other people, right? And how do we think about what is our relationship to each other? And the moment that you start looking at other people as other human beings that have an inherent right to dignity, government policies change dramatically. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So about 3 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, I was part of a group of kind of NGO advocates, so, public, civil rights advocates who got to visit Germany and Norway to study their prison systems. And for me, it was actually very emotional to go to Germany. I'd never been to Germany before. As I mentioned when we started, I have family who died in the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a major part of my identity growing up. And here I was being invited to go to Germany to study it as a model for anything. And I'm like, what? I'm not going to go to Germany to study it as a model. But then I calmed down a bit and I was like, yeah, let me go test this out. And the trip actually started in a concentration camp. So, oh my God, it was like one of the most emotional days of my life. So I land from the plane and we go on a bus, we go to a concentration camp. The concentration camp, it was just outside of Hamburg. It closed right after World War II and became a prison. Because these concentration camps, the facilities were similar to prison facilities, right? You have huge barracks. You could throw in as many human beings as possible in cages. But in the 1970s or 80s, a movement formed in that community of survivors of that concentration camp who said, look, we want to turn this into a memorial site. So can you close down the prison and turn it into a memorial site for people who perished here? And the government responded and they turned it into a memorial site. And now it's a concentration camp, prison, now a memorial site. And in Germany, their whole criminal justice system is based on the Nazi Holocaust experience, where they were like, okay, when someone violates societal norms, we need to do something about it, but we need to do it in a way that centers human dignity in how we respond. So the purpose of prisons are not to dehumanize you as much as possible by putting you in a cell that's a quarter of the size of the room that I'm sitting in right now, by solitary confinement, by completely disconnecting you and humiliating you. Their whole system is the opposite, right? It's all about rehabilitating you, giving you the life skills that you need to succeed. And it was based on the Nazi Holocaust experience. In the United States today, we have prisons that are literally on the side of old slave plantations. Like slave plantations that were turned into prisons. Angola in Louisiana is the prime example. One of the worst slave plantation sites, and today like one of the worst prison sites in America, where literally you still have basically black people toiling the fields while white corrections officers on horseback are watching over them. Can you imagine in the US if we said, let's close down this prison and turn it into a memorial site for the people who were killed during slavery and when this was a slave plantation? That's not happening in the US because we've completely dehumanized, A, the black experience, and B, what it means, the way we treat other people.
Well, we also privatized the prison, a bulk of the prison system decades ago. And, so you talk about Germany, and it seems like, the way that they're able to implement those things, and it's in a very efficient way, is because it's government run. How do we affect change in a prison system that's primarily been privatized? It's not run by the government. And if I'm owning something, I want it to be full.
Yeah.
Like I manage this recording studio.
And it's a beautiful recording studio.
Well, thank you very much. Shout out to John Leadersdorf. Thanks for letting us do the podcast here. Beautiful Lake House Recording Studios in sunny Asbury Park. But if I own a prison, I don't want that prison to be rehabilitating people. I want the beds full and I want to expand it. It's not full enough. I want it fuller. How do we get around that from a legal perspective or just from a personal perspective of yours? How do we get around the privatization of prisons?
So I'm going to say something that's really unpopular right now. If we close down all private prisons tomorrow, we would still have mass incarceration in the United States. So of the 2 million people who are incarcerated in the US, only about 8% are in private prisons. It's different in the immigration context, but in the criminal law context, about 8%. So actually the biggest profiteer off of prisons is the government. Our public employees, our corrections unions, our police unions. And I'm pro-labor movement, but I want to call a spade a spade. There is a lot of profit to be made in prison. Don't get me wrong here, but most of that profit is made by municipalities, counties, rural towns, upstate New York, right, where most people who are incarcerated in New York come from New York City. They're shipped from New York City and put into prisons in rural towns in upstate New York. Those towns then become major spots for jobs, for good paying jobs, public jobs. These aren't private prisons. There's prison gerrymandering in most of the country right now. So not only when you're picked up from an urban area and put in a rural area in a prison, are you taking the economic base to a different area, you're counted for purposes of the census as part of that rural jurisdiction, not that urban jurisdiction. So politicians have an, so the politicians have an incentive. It is popular in the left to talk about private prisons, and I get that temptation. We're against private prisons, but I also want to be clear that government is actually worse and is the biggest perpetuator of mass incarceration in the United States, because there are other incentives there were political incentives, right? During the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you would run for president of the United States or for the mayor of Asbury Park or for the governor of New Jersey under a tough on crime platform. There was a political incentive to do that, or at least you thought there would be. You ran under platforms that said, literally the 1996 Democratic Party platform, because we study this with my students. We go through the party platforms every 4 years. It called for more death penalty. It called for treating juveniles as adults when it comes. That used to be what the Democratic Party talked about. That's how you would get elected, or at least they thought they would. That is a political incentive that led to mass incarceration. So yes, there's a private prison component that we strongly are against. Yes, there are other private companies that make money off of prisons, like who gets to serve you the food in the prison, who's the caterer, or who supplies the phone calls. but government is the biggest perpetuator.
So you're saying that's small peanuts compared. I didn't know that, so I appreciate the education on that. And it's very interesting to hear about how the sort of gerrymandering the population during the census, and then of course allocating funds away from the cities where these folks are
and congressional
extracted.
representation, like how many House members do you have and where are they? It's huge.
One of the first steps, I know when you were working in, at least for the New Jersey chapter of the ACLU, was bail reform.
Oh, yeah.
And I only, maybe 7, 8-ish years ago, really got not a comprehensive education on this, but just started thinking about it just myself, and then I researched and read books and blah, blah, blah. For those who are not hip to this, it's pretty simple, and I'm sure you'll unpack it in a smart way, but you get arrested, and in many cases, you're posted bail, which means, okay, well, you have a court date. If you can't post bail, you have to wait in a jail. If you can post bail, be it $100 or $100,000, you can go home until you have your court case. Now, obviously, if you don't have the money, you're not going home. You're sitting in jail. And the court system is so backed up that some of these people are sitting in jails and then prisons, even federal prisons, awaiting a trial because they couldn't post a $600 bail. And I learned of this, and I was like, like anything, when you get your eyes open, you're like, shit, that's fucked up.
It's fucked up.
And you can call it any bias you want. Ultimately, it's an economic bias. It's an economic bias. If you have, you're good, or you're better off. If you don't have, you have to wait here. And it was just like, a shit.
Yeah.
How has bail reform changed while you were working in New Jersey, and what still needs to be done nationally, and what can you tell the good folks watching through the glass here to get hip to?
First of all, that was a great way to describe it, so kudos. Like, I love the way you just described, because that was right on. Literally today, as we're sitting here, we have about 500,000 people in the United States who are in a jail behind bars as what we call pretrial detainees. They haven't been convicted of anything. They have not been convicted of anything. But 500,000 people right now, as we speak, are in a jail awaiting their trial. That's about 1 in 5 people. When we think about, when the fanatics on the right, when the New York Post tries to make it seem as if we need more prisons, more jails. They paint a picture that somehow everyone in there, is going to shoot you if they were let out. 1 in 5 people who are incarcerated haven't even been convicted of anything.
1 in 5.
1 in 5, about 20%, which is equivalent to close to 500,000 a day. I think it's around 400,000, 450,000 a shift. This is one of the greatest injustices in our nation today. I genuinely believe that. And it's not only an economic injustice, actually. I put a racial lens on everything, and it's just like my own personal value system, but I generally believe it. Because whenever we talk about any criminal legal system issues, the disparities among blacks and whites are so extreme, right? If a black boy born today has a 1 in 3 chance of ending up incarcerated at one point in their life. 1 in 3 chance. There are such extreme racial disparities in who's incarcerated. I believe if white people were being treated this way, the system would have been fixed by now. So that's why I also, in addition to economic interests, I also look at this from a racial justice lens. But bail reform is one of these areas where we haven't even come close to fixing the problem, but there's a lot of experimentation on how to fix the problem. So New Jersey has been a leader on this issue and was it was actually the first state in the nation to comprehensively try to change the system. And it enacted bail reform. And since New Jersey enacted this bail reform, our jail population has gone down. I mean, last time I checked, it was like 20 to 25%. It may even be up to 30% at this point.
Wow.
Which is great. And crime continues to be at historic lows, which, shows that mass incarceration and crime have nothing to do with each other. By the way, that's a really important point. It's one of the first things I teach my students when we start our classes. When we think about how do prison populations grow or decrease, it has nothing to do with crime, right? It has to do with how do we decide to respond to certain human behaviors.
Right, because punishment is not a deterrent. I mean, you could study it politically, you could study it in prisons, you could study it in child psychology.
Right. No, but also, I mean, let me give it there are about 1.3 million arrests a year for drug possession in the United States. 1.3 million. Does that mean that only 1.3 million times a year someone possesses drugs? No. I mean, look, I wouldn't want to do a review here of Lake House Studio, but I teach at Princeton University on campus, and there's plenty of drugs being possessed on campus, but students aren't getting arrested for it, right? Because a political decision was made, or just no decision was not made about arresting someone. But you go 9 miles down the street to Trenton, and people are getting arrested for drug possession, right? These are political decisions that are made around how to. So on bail, we've seen places like New Jersey do some things right. Having said that, New Jersey was part of the first wave of bail reform, and New Jersey did something that today is considered more controversial, and that the way New Jersey, and I'm about to get in the weeds, I apologize, but you asked, New Jersey implemented bail reform by using what are called algorithms to try to determine, it's basically a computation that a judge now gets around how likely is this person going to skip bail or reoffend. And it's not binding on the judge, but it's a number that gets popped out that says, here is kind of the chances based on an algorithm.
What are the factors in that algorithm?
Great question. So New Jersey implemented what I consider one of the best algorithms. It's called the Arnold algorithm. And the factors that it takes into consideration are, have you ever skipped on bail before? Was the crime that you committed a violent crime or a nonviolent crime? Factors like that. And there's only about a handful of factors that are taken into consideration. There are other algorithms out there in the world that take other things into consideration as well. Like, do you have a job? Are you without a home? Which we consider more controversial. But New Jersey did that. These days, the experimentation that is happening, so Illinois, just about 3 weeks ago, passed bail reform. So this just happened. And the bail reform that they implemented in New Jersey does not have one of these, machine algorithms. It creates more standards that say, okay, here's when the government can detain you pretrial, or at least consider detaining you pretrial, and here's where they can't. I'm getting in the weeds here. I don't want to, but the point is, we still have hundreds of thousands of people on any given day who are detained pretrial, most of them because they can't afford cash bail. Talk about private motives, private corporation motives. Bail is an area where big companies are making a lot of money off of it. So this is a big counter to what I said earlier.
Well, lending organizations.
Exactly.
Yeah, of course.
So the big, when we think of bail, we think of these bail bond shops, right? The line city streets. There are about 15,000 of them in the United States. But there's only about a handful of these bail bond shops are usually mom and pop shops. They actually can't afford to give you the loan to bail you out. They borrow the money. And there's about a handful of insurance companies that lend the money. And it's these insurance companies that are making billions off of this. So one of the things that I lead at the ACLU is we've been getting these insurance companies to divest and applying political pressure on them to say, you're going to get out of the bail bond business because it's unethical. And guess what? The biggest owner of for-profit bail right now in the United States is a Canadian-based company called Fairfax Financial. For-profit bail is illegal in Canada. The US and the Philippines are the only two nations in the world that allow for-profit bail. The biggest owner of for-profit bail in America is a Canadian company where it's illegal, but they own the biggest share of the for-profit bail business in the United States. So we've been applying pressure on this Canadian company to try to get them to divest. We've been working with Senator Booker and others on that.
It's super scary that we share anything
with the Philippines.
With the Philippines with respect to criminal justice.
Yeah.
Because that's one of the most hardcore places on
particularly on
planet
drugs.
earth.
On drugs.
Like,
I mean, they were literally killing people.
They'll just murder you.
Yeah.
Like,
and remember,
forget
Trump.
trial. Forget
Right.
a trial. Like, hey, I think my neighbor might have some weed. We got this. You just get popped.
Yeah.
By some dude on a moped.
Look, we share a lot. You know, we're one of, you know, our death penalty practices are aligned with, you know, just the most undemocratic countries in the world. When it comes to the criminal legal system in the United States, we are nowhere where other kind of rich Western style democracies are. We're like in a completely different class. We incarcerate more people than any other nation in the world by far. We have like 7 to 8 times the incarceration rate of our population than Western European countries do. We're just an anomaly. And I would argue it's all because of race. You know, that's a whole other thing we could talk about. You know, when I look at mass incarceration in the United States, I 100% consider it a legacy of slavery in the United States. It's the new Jim Crow. We could spend 3 hours talking about that. But I think that's what distinguishes us from other nations, where we still haven't had a reckoning in the United States with the fact that we enslaved people for hundreds of years. And then even when we technically stopped slavery, we found other ways to maintain, you know, white supremacy. And our mass incarceration system is one of those ways. Because if it was the majority white people who were being treated this way, there is no way we would have allowed it to continue the way we do it today. And in fact, when you look at the trajectory of when mass incarceration rose in the United States, it was in reaction to the civil rights movement, right? It was in reaction to the gains that were being made, where politicians realized that they could change their narrative to maintain the status quo and they would win, right? Richard Nixon,
well, what a
Ronald
shame
Reagan.
that politicians think so poorly of the population. I mean, whether it's true or not, the fact that they're playing on those really base fears, it's really disgusting.
I mean, when we were growing up, right? I mean, you know, the 1988 presidential election, literally one of the reasons that, you know, George H.W. Bush won is because of the Willie Horton political ad, where he showed a black man who a Michael Dukakis let out of prison over the weekend, black man who raped and killed a white woman. And that was the political ad that played all the time that helped, you know, the first George Bush, you know, win a presidential election. Politicians knew that, and they used the race baiting, they used the fear mongering as a way to build their political power.
It's the same as any other advertiser. I mean, fear is king.
Totally.
If you're looking to persuade people, and that's something that I think a lot of folks need to get over their fears and look.
But it's scary. You know, I started, one of the big things that I did after Donald Trump was elected, because it was so shocking to me, and I was wrong to be shocked, by the way, was I started to subscribe to all these right-wing newsletters. And kind of, you know, so I'm one of these people in the morning, I get like 30 different email of like, you know, compilations from like, whether it's like the New Yorker and the New York Times, but also the Federalist or National Review or the New York Post. So I started reading the New York Post almost every day. If that was my entire world, if all I did was read the New York Post every day, I would literally think that people are being killed on the streets of New York City every single moment, that there's like bloodshed, that children are being like thrown out of windows, basically. It is scary. It is scary. But then I look at statistics and I'm like, yeah, okay, last year shootings were up and other, you know, things that we care about were up. But actually already this year, serious violent crime is significantly down. New York City is still so much safer than it was like 20 years ago. It's a much more nuanced approach. But if that's all you read every day, it is a scary world. And then you start fearing your neighbor. You start fearing anyone who doesn't look like you. And that's so much of how policymaking has been done in this country, because politicians will exploit that. That's what Donald Trump exploited.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the average person is getting their information from a source that ultimately is a corporation, giving them ideas that they should consider and most of the time be afraid of. It's not easy to find smart, independent media, but it's not that difficult either. And I implore people, please explore there's so many great journalists and reporters doing excellent work. You're not going to see them interviewed on anything on television. You're certainly not going
Maybe
to see
the Daily Show.
Don't get me started. Don't get me started. I don't want to talk about Daily Show.
Well, also, we got to give love to Jon Stewart. I mean, we're here in
He's
New
good.
Jersey.
Jersey guy. Jersey
Yeah.
guy.
Monmouth County, no? I mean, that's where he lives now, no? Or is he still in...
I don't know. No, Jon Stewart's cool.
Yeah.
But overall, I mean, but it was almost unfortunate that some things that were pointed out and some truths had to just land as comedy. Like,
right.
It's funny, but at some point, and I think that point was probably in the last 7, 8, 9 years, it's not so funny anymore. I don't think it's that funny anymore. So I implore people, please find some independent media sources. There's some great journalists. I think of the work that Chris Hedges has done. He's a Princeton guy, right? And he teaches in prisons. Does he also teach at Princeton University?
I don't know if he does. I mean, I've seen him lecture in the town. I don't know if he's officially affiliated with the university. Look, there's a lot of good independent media out there, but one of the things we have to recognize, though, and it's something I think a lot about, most people do not have time, right? Most people, and I'm sympathetic to that, actually. Most people have really full lives, right? They have a tough job where they're trying to make ends meet. They come home, they're exhausted. They may have, I also have a 4-month-old at home right now. So
who hasn't slept in 4 months?
I haven't slept in 4 months, literally, including last night, which is why I keep intaking this coffee. But it's like, they're not going to spend 30 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever minutes to read that, 15-page awesome feature in the New Yorker or something. It's one of our biggest struggles, right? As people who are constantly who are fighting for social justice and social change, is how do we deliver information? And we gotta tell, one of the things that the left needs to do a better job of, and we have been, I think the left has been doing a better job of, is simplifying the story, and tugging at the emotional. By the way, going back to the marriage equality movement, when the narrative in the marriage equality movement actually changed from equality and fairness to love and compassion, it was like a major shift in the way the public responded. Right? This idea of fairness and equality, which to me is incredibly appealing, right? That is my value-based system. That is like what I'm all about. But actually to the masses, when you kind of talk about love and relationship and family, oh my God, that's when it changes. That's when most people are like, okay, this doesn't feel like a political soundbite. It feels like...
That's a great call. Nothing brings people... so we both have kids. I don't know how many of our listeners have kids. Maybe some of them will at some point. But once you do, it's one of the very, very, very few things that everybody can kind of get lovey about, right? Like, it's a smart move.
And in the mass incarceration space, so one of the big things that I've done at the ACLU, I started in 2016. One of the first things that I did was prioritize hiring people who are formerly incarcerated to do our work. So it was no longer kind of the white guy, who's had a pretty privileged background, life, talking about why mass incarceration is wrong. And look, I have a role to play, and I'm a validator in many ways, and I could get to communities that will listen to me because of my own kind of privilege. But I can't speak about it as to here's what happened to me and really get to the tug of the heart of it. We have, staff, a third of all of our hires at the ACLU to work on criminal justice issues have been people who are formerly incarcerated, have been people who not only are policy experts, but can also talk about, and here's how this impacted my life.
Yeah, well, who's going to be more passionate about something than if
But it's not only passionate, it's also who are people going to listen to, because it becomes more of an emotional experience. When people listen to me, they may have an intellectual experience, which is good, but and there's a role for that. But it's the emotional experience. To draw an equivalent, I want to marry John because I love John. But the government right now tells me I cannot marry him. It's totally different than the guy saying it is unfair and unequal for John and Udi not to be able to get married. It's an injustice. It's a totally different emotional experience.
You touched on it before when you said people are afraid of things that don't look like them. So the more you see things that don't look or sound like you, but you see it, you see that person speaking well, doing well, talking about commonalities, marriage, relationships, children, all these things. I think it's a good point. It's one way to allow people to, even if they don't physically step out of their bubble, bringing other bubbles to them, and they see it, and most people are taking things in.
At the end of the day, that's what people want. Like, people just want to have a good life. They want to be able to provide for their children. They want to be with their children. They want to have, if they choose to have children, or with their loved ones, they want to go on dates. They want to hang out with friends. That's what life is about at the end of the day. And it's our job to make that life accessible to everyone and as much equity as possible.
Yeah, people just want to hang out and have a good time.
Totally.
Speaking of hanging out and having a good time, you had one of the best parties of all time. Remember when we all just camped out in your backyard? Like, you have a beautiful house. We all could have found a couch or a place on the floor, but we had all these fucking tents.
Oh my God, it was so much fun.
In the backyard. That was great.
It was so great.
I can't wait to camp out in your backyard. I'm putting a little pressure on you right now.
No, trust me. Right now, we could go, cross-country skiing in our backyard. I mean, it's just full of snow. But I love community, right? And having all of our friends camp out, and then having you play the guitar while everyone is just chilling out. Seeing our kids run around with each other. Literally, that is when I'm at my happiest. When I see the people that I love. We won't even mention the extreme. What is it? Didn't we do extreme bocce?
We will mention it, Udi, because I won that competition. Maybe
I have the video. I think I have the video on my phone I could show.
Dude, I would love to see that video after this podcast. We're not fancy enough for us to throw that up on the screen, but let me give you a taste. So we're probably playing regular bocce for a certain amount of time, which I'm also very good at. Team Italia over here. The Israeli bocce team. You never hear about them.
Not as good.
You never hear about them.
It's almost as good as the Israeli bobsledding team.
Well, if Jamaica can do it, you guys can do it. We I don't know. We invented some kind of game where you had to do the most acrobatic, or dangerous, or just the most over the top bocce toss, but actually still have it get near the palino, which is the small...
And we filmed it in slow motion.
Yeah, and I took home the gold by doing almost like having a ball like a shot put, doing a full cartwheel and having it sort of shot put during the cartwheel, luckily not hitting the side of my skull because bocce balls are super heavy and dense, and getting right near the palino. I'm pretty sure it was a unanimous...
I think so.
Coronation.
We're all really proud of you.
I'm so proud of myself.
It was like 1980s skateboarding or 1990s skateboarding style move, where it was just watching in slow-mo is just perfection.
I was beautiful.
You were beautiful.
For that moment. Well, it was really, I was trying to reckon with the fact that I was so shitty at skateboarding in the 80s. I was always the worst one.
Really?
So there's so few physical moments where I can really even get close to the stage.
Until you hang out with me, and then you're like, wow.
Dude, I love you, man. I really appreciate you coming.
I love what you're doing here. I gotta say, I listened to, I think, what do you have now? This is, you've done 6 or 7 episodes. I've listened to half of them.
This is the 9th, I think.
Wow.
This is our 9th episode, and they haven't pulled the plug yet, so... Well, I'm getting some really swank people like yourself now.
Totally, yeah. I don't know, man. It's going to be hard to top Bad Religion. That is going to be, hopefully that won't be your peak, because that was pretty awesome.
I appreciate you checking out. You also checked out, we had Renee Maskin from Lowlight.
You
said you're a fan.
I'm a huge fan of Lowlight. I totally am. I have this mix that I made for my daughter. Lowlight's all over it. It's in my own personal mix. I saw them at SeaHearNow a couple of years ago, and I just fell in love with them. I love them.
Shout out to Renee and the rest of Lowlight. Udi Ofer, thank you for coming on Through the Glass. I appreciate you, brother.
I appreciate you. Thank you.
All right. Goodbye.